Clara stood by the glass, watching the street below. Passers-by tilted their heads back, gazing up at her floor with expressions that suggested they were imagining a life of flawless grace. Inside, the morning light hit the hardwood floors at a sharp angle. Fresh lilies sat on the kitchen island, their scent heavy in the air. Her calendar was a dense grid of commitments, and her phone vibrated against the marble countertop with a relentless stream of new invitations. It was a masterpiece of a life. She turned away from the window and caught her reflection in the glass. The sunlight caught her eyes, but they remained flat. She stared at the woman in the reflection, searching for the person everyone else seemed to see. There was nothing there. The silence of the apartment felt less like peace and more like a vacuum. She reached out, pressing her palm against the cold surface, and felt the disconnect tighten in her chest. Everything outside the glass was moving, vibrant and full, while everything inside remained static, hollowed out by a hunger she could not name. She looked back down at the street, but the people were just dots now, moving through a world she no longer felt she inhabited. The day began with a cold cup of coffee. She took one sip, tasted the bitterness, and left the mug forgotten on the counter. The morning rush was a frantic blur of keys, doors, and the heavy thud of her bag hitting the floor. Once inside the car, she gripped the steering wheel until her knuckles turned white. The traffic was a wall of steel, gridlocked and motionless, crawling forward 1 inch at a time. She stared at the brake lights ahead, her pulse thumping in her ears. Time slipped away while she sat trapped in the idling engine. Reaching the office brought no relief. She sat at her desk, the screen glow illuminating her face, and began the purge. Her mouse clicked with a sharp, rhythmic frequency. Delete, 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 delete. Dozens of emails vanished into the digital void with every twitch of her finger. Her jaw remained tight, grinding against the pressure of the mounting queue. Each click was a mechanical strike against a day that felt already lost. She did not look up from the monitor, her shoulders hunched against the hum of the office, fueled only by the need to clear the screen before the clock struck noon. The office lights dimmed, but the pressure did not. Clara entered her apartment, the air already thick with a tension that had been building for weeks. A voice rose from the living room, sharp, accusing. She countered, her words cutting through the space with a jagged edge. They stood in the center of the room, voices climbing until they were no longer communicating, just colliding. Every sentence was a strike. Every silence between them was a trap. She felt the blood thrumming in her temples, a frantic pulse that demanded release. She threw her bag toward the couch. It missed, sliding across the floor with a harsh scrape. He turned away, and the finality of the movement forced her hand. She marched to the front door, gripped the heavy handle, and pulled. The frame rattled in its casing. She slammed it shut with such force that the pictures on the hallway wall shuddered. Then, she stood still. The silence that followed was not empty. It was heavy, pressing against her eardrums like deep water. She remained in the entryway, watching the dust motes dance in the sliver of light from the hallway, listening to the hollow echo of her own breathing. The apartment had become a tomb. The silence in the room began to itch. It crawled over her skin, a persistent, physical pressure that made the walls feel as if they were leaning inward. Clara tossed her keys onto the kitchen counter. The thud was loud, a blunt sound that did nothing to break the stillness. She paced the length of the floor, 3 steps, pivot, 3 steps back. The air in the apartment felt thin, recycled, and entirely used up. She reached for the door handle, her movements jerky and uncoordinated. Once outside, the winter air bit at her face, sharp and immediate. She did not wait for the elevator, taking the stairs 2 at a time until she hit the pavement. The rain started as a light drizzle, then intensified into a steady, rhythmic lashing against the streetlights. She found her car and climbed inside, the interior smelling of stale air and cold leather. She did not turn the key. Instead, she stared through the windshield at the gray mist swirling beyond the glass. The wipers moved in a sluggish, hypnotic arc, clearing a path that led nowhere. She gripped the wheel, her knuckles turning pale, watching the distorted shapes of the city dissolve into the downpour. The world outside the window was a blur of charcoal and slate, and she remained trapped in the driver's seat, listening to the rain hammer against the roof. A flicker of movement caught her eye near the curb. A bus stop, huddled under a rusted overhang, provided the only shelter for a solitary figure. An elderly woman stood there, her body bent against the gale, clutching two plastic bags that groaned under the weight of their contents. Rain poured off the brim of her hat in unbroken streams. Her feet were encased in saturated dark fabric that clung to her ankles. Clara watched, expecting the woman to seek cover or collapse. Instead, the woman tilted her head back. She stared directly into the gray, churning clouds above. Her mouth widened. A sound cut through the roar of the rain, a laugh. It was bright, sudden, and completely unbothered by the freezing deluge. The woman's face transformed, the deep lines around her eyes softening into a genuine, radiant expression. She stood there, drenched and shivering, yet she seemed entirely at peace with the storm. Clara leaned forward, her chest tightening. The steering wheel felt cold and alien beneath her grip. She searched the woman's face for a sign of madness, for a trick of the light, but found only a profound, grounded joy. The laughter continued, rhythmic and defiant, shattering the silence of the car and leaving Clara breathless in the dark. Clara looked down. Her own hands were buried deep in the pockets of a leather jacket, the material soft and expensive. She glanced back at the bus stop. The woman's coat was thin, a frayed, woven thing that offered no protection against the biting wind. The contrast was a physical blow. Clara shifted in her seat, the luxury of the heated cabin suddenly feeling like a cage. She looked at the dashboard, at the polished wood and the glowing digital clock, and then at the woman's soaked shoes. The woman had almost nothing, yet she held onto that laughter as if it were a solid, tangible treasure. Clara's breath hitched in her throat, a sharp, ragged sound. She tried to reconcile the two realities: her own life, filled with every object she had ever wanted, and the hollow, echoing silence that followed her into the dark. Her grip on the steering wheel loosened until her fingers went numb. The vanity of her own possessions burned in the low light of the dashboard. She sat motionless, the engine idling, watching the woman lean against the bus stop pole. Every comfort Clara had curated felt like a hollow shell compared to the quiet, rhythmic peace radiating from the stranger in the rain. The car engine cut out, leaving the night to settle into a heavy, absolute silence. Clara walked through her front door and left the main lights off. She crossed the room by memory, her hand trailing along the wall until she reached the bedside lamp. A single click filled the corner with a pool of amber light. She did not look at the rest of the room. She reached for the frame on the nightstand, a picture of a beach she had spent years working to visit. Her thumb traced the edge of the glass, feeling the cold, smooth surface against her skin. She set it down and moved to the edge of the bed. Her fingers found the wool blanket her grandmother had knitted. She pulled it over her lap, bunching the thick, coarse yarn between her palms. She squeezed, feeling the resistance of the wool, the slight itch of the fibers against her skin. It was real. It was here. She closed her eyes and pressed the fabric to her face, breathing in the scent of cedar and dust. The world outside the window ceased to matter. The only thing that existed was the weight of the wool and the hard, grounding reality of the frame beneath her hand. She sat in the quiet, finally anchored to the physical world. She stood in the kitchen, the silence of the apartment pressing in from all sides. Then, the heater kicked in. A steady, rhythmic click sounded, followed by the low hum of warm air flowing into the room. It was a mechanical, repetitive noise, yet it cut through the winter chill with precision. Clara turned her head, following the sound. She looked at the refrigerator, packed with enough food to last the week. She looked at the walls, at the clean lines of the kitchen island, and at the floorboards that caught the light of the lamp. She remembered the nights she had spent on her knees years ago, begging for this exact stability. She had prayed for these walls. She had pleaded for the very refrigerator that now hummed in the corner. She had worked until her hands shook to secure this life, only to spend every day since then looking for a way to escape it. The realization hit her like a physical weight. She was not trapped in a life she hated. She was living the life she had once desperately begged to have. The heater clicked again, a final, sharp punctuation mark in the quiet. She stood motionless, the truth settling into her bones, turning the familiar room into something she was seeing for the first time. The morning alarm hummed, but Clara did not reach for her phone. She lay still, listening to the silence of the room. She stood up and sat on the floor, holding her coffee mug with both hands, feeling the warmth seep into her palms. She watched the first light of dawn paint the skyline, a slow transition from gray to soft gold. She picked up the receiver and dialed her mother. The ringing tone sounded steady and rhythmic. When her mother answered, Clara did not speak of deadlines or work. She listened to the familiar voice, waiting until she heard her mother laugh. The sound filled the space. Later, she walked to the train station instead of running. She took long, measured steps, noticing the way the wind moved through the trees lining the street. A sudden jolt of the train caused a coffee spill to stain her sleeve. She paused. She did not curse the day. She simply wiped the liquid away with a napkin and looked back out the window. The bills still arrived, and the work deadlines remained, but she stopped viewing every minor friction as a catastrophe. The world had not changed, but her hands were steady, and her breathing was slow. One spring afternoon, Clara sat on a wooden park bench. Her feet rested directly on the grass, and she felt the cool, firm texture of the earth beneath her. A group of children raced past the bench, their laughter echoing against the trees, sharp and bright. She closed her eyes. The sun pressed against her skin, a steady physical warmth that she had spent years ignoring in her rush to get elsewhere. She focused on the rhythm of her own breathing, slow and unforced. A single tear tracked down her cheek, cooling as it moved toward her jaw. It was not a tear of sorrow, but a weightless release. She was here. She was breathing. She was part of the world around her. She opened her eyes as a cluster of bubbles drifted through the air, catching the light and refracting the landscape in miniature. She reached out, watching them pop against the breeze. She did not need a promotion, a new apartment, or a different path to justify her existence. She watched the bubbles vanish and finally saw the beauty in the ordinary, simple act of being alive.